Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Organizational Behaviour Buzzy 1029. In this video, we're going to talk about personality and the theory of individual differences. So by the end of the session, we're going to be in a position where hopefully you can define what we mean by individual differences, describe the nature of personality and people's personalities, be able to interpret psychometric test results or understand psychometric test results, and consider the theory of the self. The key reading for this in the 6th edition of Huxinski and Buchanan is chapter 5, and it's chapter 6 in the 9th edition. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're starting to move on to now think about how we can explain people's behaviour in organisations, how we can explain why people engage in things like power and politics, how we can explain why certain people are more motivated than others to behave in certain ways. Organisational psychologists believe that our personalities are key causes of our organisational behaviour. So the technical word for this is antecedents. The idea here is that our personality is antecedent or causes our behaviour in organisations. So based on this understanding, psychologists have tried to understand different types of personalities and link them to different types of organisational behaviours. And to do that, they've developed a number of different ways of theorising personalities, of explaining personalities. Like many of the concepts that we've covered on this course, you probably kind of intuitively think you know what a personality is, but if you stop and think about it more academically, it's a little bit more tricky. And what we're going to see in this class is that there are some very different ways of thinking about measuring and describing people's personalities. Behind this approach, though, is a theory known as individual differences. And the idea in individual differences is that there are some dimensions or factors or elements or categories or criteria which everybody shares, but that we don't all share in the same way. So an example of this would be height. Height is a standard way of measuring people, which allows us to expose differences between individuals. So once we have a concept of height, we can measure people and describe taller people, smaller people, and so on and so forth. Weight, age, these are all factors which allow us to express individual differences. These allow us to express physical differences. When we do a test in school, for example, like our A-levels, these are exposing individual differences in our intelligence. Another good example of individual differences is IQ. These are standardized tests which help us to rank and score people in terms of their intelligence, although things like IQ are very controversial. The idea is, when we're measuring personalities, we want to try to find similar ways, like IQ, like height, like weight. We want to try and find similar dimensions that allow us to describe differences between people along the same criteria. And this is the starting point for what's known as personality theory in organisational psychology. Informed by the notion of individual differences, organisational psychologists have tried to find different elements of personalities which everybody shares to different extents, so that we can measure people's personalities in the same way that we measure people's heights, weights, or intelligence. So behind personality theory, there's a couple of technical terms and relationships that are useful to go through. In personality theory, we distinguish between someone's behaviour, which is how they act, someone's attitudes, which is what they think about things, and their underlying traits, which is their personality type. So let's work through just an obvious example. Let's say somebody is very outgoing, loud, happy to speak up in meetings. That's a behaviour. It's not a personality type, it's a behaviour. So how can we explain that behaviour? Well, it might be that we find everybody that's very loud and outgoing and speaks up in meetings feels very comfortable around other people. They don't feel shy, they don't feel nervous. And we could then say, well, that attitude, that feeling, might itself be explained by an underlying trait, which we could call extroversion. And we can then measure people on the extent to which they display that trait in terms of whether or not they express the attitude or display the behaviour. So this is the underlying theory behind personality theory. It's trying to find traits which express individual differences and can be measured in terms of people's behaviours or attitudes. So there's different ways of trying to uncover those traits. There's some kind of technical terms in this slide which we won't go through, but broadly speaking, there's a distinction between what's sometimes called the positivist or nomothetic approach, which tries to measure and quantify differences between individuals in terms of their personality traits. And then there's the phenomenological or ideographic approach, which tries to understand individuals in their own terms, tries to understand individuals' subjective experiences. So let's look at some examples of them. In terms of the more phenomenological or ideographic approach, a classic example would be the thematic apperception test, sometimes known as the Rorschach test. Some of you hopefully are familiar with these terms. In the thematic apperception test, individuals are shown a set of standard images which are very ambiguous, and they're asked to explain what's going on in those images. And the interviewer literally just asks them to explain and then doesn't say anything. And in describing what's going on, individuals are able to pick out key elements of the images which tell us something about their underlying personality types. Are they more fearful? Are they confident? Do they interpret images in terms of success or in terms of defeat? By describing the images ideographically, people reveal something about their personalities. And it's been shown, oops, that's not meant to be there. It's been shown that when people look at these kinds of images, they reveal some common personality types or common personality traits, such as competitiveness, a need for order or closure, a need for achievement. All of these traits can be revealed through people's descriptions of images like the one you see in front of you. One of the ideas underlying this is the notion that people aren't fully aware of themselves. And this led a famous psychoanalyst called called Carl Jung, although Sigmund Freud is a famous psychoanalyst, Carl Jung's another one, to suggest that actually when you look across people's responses to things like thematic apperception tests, you tend to find that there's ultimately 4 types of individuals. There's those that he called sensation thinking, who are more practical, more down to earth, more impersonal. They're interested in fact, and they want order and precision. There are those who think in terms more intuitively, and they're conceptual, more inventive. There are those that look for sensations. They might be gregarious, outgoing, and those that are more interested in intuition and feeling. So here they like big goals. They don't really like to have rules. They like to feel things and to be intuitive. So Jung argued that essentially individuals can all be measured in terms of whether they are sensation thinking people, intuition thinking people, sensation thinking feeling people, or intuition feeling people. And this way of putting people in boxes isn't really in keeping with the ideographic approach, although it comes from that tradition. But it gives us a nice way into thinking about the nomothetic approach. So whereas the ideographic approach would ask people to talk however they wanted and to reveal their personality types, their traits, in nomothetic approaches, you would structure the responses people can give, and you're expecting people to be far more self-aware and willing to tell you their attitudes because they're aware of them. The implicit idea in the ideographic approach is that people are not consciously aware of their attitudes, but they express their attitudes when talking freely. In the nomothetic approach, you think the opposite. You think people are aware of their own attitudes. They have self-awareness, and they can tell you what it is. So the classic example of a nomothetic approach to understanding people's personalities is psychometrics. So it's literally measuring people's psychology. So in a psychometric study, instead of giving somebody a picture and asking them to talk freely, you give someone a questionnaire with statements that say things like, I think that I am outgoing. And you would say, yes, I strongly agree, I am outgoing. And the idea here is that if people agree with each of these, with certain statements, that reveals that they tend to have the trait in question. So in psychometrics, you might say, I start conversations at parties. And people that agree that, yes, they go and start conversations at parties, they're revealing that they have the extrovert trait. You can ask somebody, I feel comfortable around people. And again, people that say, yes, they are comfortable around people, reveal the extrovert trait. And so we would expect there to be an association, a correlation, a significant relationship between each of these elements. Somebody who scores I start conversations highly should also score I feel comfortable around people highly. So psychometrics, though, is really just a different method for kind of doing the same thing that Carl Jung did, which is trying to figure out some traits or some types, some categories, if you will, that we can put people in. And this, of course, goes back to the notion of individual differences, trying to find dimensions which allow us to describe differences between individuals. In psychometrics, there's some quite famous ones that we can go through. Myers-Briggs comes up with 4 scales. So the Myers-Briggs scale says people are either introvert or extrovert, and you can be measured along a continuum. They're either sensing or intuiting. They're either more thinking or feeling, or they're more judging or perceiving. And when you fill in a Myers-Briggs questionnaire, you're scored in terms of each of these categories, and then you're put into a box. There's 16 boxes, which are defined by, for example, the ENFP is more extrovert, intuiting, feeling, and perceiving. There's a whole host of other ways of doing psychometrics, and other people have come up with their own, scales, types, and traits. Eysenck talks about extroverts. He also introduces the notion of neuroticism or stability. But the one we want to talk about is MCCraws Big Five, and we want to talk about this because they're widely used in personality tests. They're widely used in practice. They're widely used in research. So McCraw said there's 5 dimensions to people's personalities, 5 traits, which we can describe everybody along. Everybody expresses these traits to a greater or lesser extent, in the same way everybody has a height, but some people are taller. So there's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. I won't go into all these details here, but you've got the sample items which you would see on a Big Five personality test. So these are the things you would be asked to agree with. So if you're open to experiences, you're somebody who's intellectually curious, open to emotions, likes to have new experiences. So, you would agree with things like, I'm quick to understand things. I'm full of ideas. And this would reveal that you have a high level of openness to experience. You would be a personality that has an openness to experience. Conscientiousness is a tendency to display self-discipline. It's typically people that like to have a relative sense of order or control. They don't like to act impulsively. So if you look at some of the sample items in a personality test that would be measuring conscientiousness, it's things like, I pay attention to details. I get chores done right away. People that score these as they represent their attitudes would be seen to have conscientious personalities. Extroversion is characterized by people who like to engage in activities with other people. Introverts typically find energy from themselves, so they're happy being on their own, engaging in activities which are more thoughtful. Extroverts tend to get energy from other people and experiences. So if you look at some of the sample items, things like I start conversations. Well, if you want to go and start conversations, it's because you enjoy getting energy from interacting with people. That means you're an extrovert. Agreeableness is how much people value getting along with other people or affiliation. People with high agreeableness tend to be interested in other people and sympathise with other people. They tend to take time out for others and not be self-centred. And again, you see the examples of this in the types of items which people would ask on a psychometric questionnaire. Neuroticism is the tendency to experience negative emotions, such as anxiety, depression, anger. This is sometimes called emotional instability. So it's people who are unable to deal with stressful or unusual situations without getting irritated or angry. And again, you see this in the types of items which would be used. So if somebody who scores highly on I get set easily would be revealing that they have a certain attitude that reflects their underlying neurotic personality type. Filling in a questionnaire with these sample items then allows you and other people to measure your personality type and to see which type of personality you tend to be. So you can have a score like this picture here, which would be, your individual score, but you can also start to compare and contrast people. This is found to be really important in organisations because personality types have been shown, although inconsistently, to create different types of team members, to give you an indication of how people are going to respond to different types of organisational settings. So, we know, for example, that people with a certain personality type tend to have more heart disease because they get more stress than other people. This was findings by Feedman and Roseman. If you were looking for, people to deal with more creative tasks, perhaps designers, you probably don't want neurotic people that struggle with new experiences, that tend to get angry. You'd probably want people who were more open. If you're looking for a manager, you might want somebody who's more agreeable or conscientious, that's going to make sure jobs get done and pay attention to other people. In fact, it's been shown that people who score highly for agreeableness tend to be very transformational leaders. They tend to be able to get the best out of their team because of their personality type. And it's for this reason that we know many organisations, particularly like graduate employers, use these kinds of personality tests in their recruitment. A little while ago now, Marchington and Wilkinson did a survey, and they found that 46% of organisations, and mainly big organisations, use personality questionnaires in recruitment at some point. And they do this because personality questionnaires, unlike things like the thematic apperception test, are easy to administer. You can do them online. They're a quick way of sorting through candidates. And most people assume that the personality types can predict work performance. In fact, you can take whole courses. There's training courses you can go on. I think even our careers service will give you training courses in how to answer psychometric tests to make sure you look as good as possible. There are, though, some weaknesses with psychometric tests. Firstly, whilst many people assume that personality predicts work performance and organisational behaviour, the research is a little bit inconsistent. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot of moderating and mediating variables or contextual factors which change the results. Secondly, there's questions as to whether psychometrics really measure the personality type or just allow people to tell you what they think you want to hear. So when you ask people to do a personality test and then repeat it, they tend to get a completely different personality type. Or many people tend to be aware of the personality tests and try to shape what personality they want to be. Like, not many people want to score highly on neuroticism. And if you look at some of the scale items, they're things that you don't really want to admit about yourself, like I worry about things, or I'm much more anxious than most people. Most people would prefer to say, I don't feel anxious and I don't get upset easily, even if they do. But they're super popular. So let's think of some other interesting psychometric dimensions that people measure. Some are taken from things like thematic apperception tests, like the need for achievement. And there's a really nice inventory or set of scales or items that you can use to measure somebody's need for achievement or how motivated they are by achievement. Over the last couple of decades, many organisations have been interested in understanding what they call the emotional intelligence of people. And their emotional intelligence is sort of like IQ, but EQ. It's their ability to be aware of other people's feelings and their own feelings, and their ability to moderate their feelings. This is seen to be particularly important in organisational settings where, people typically don't want people that get very, very emotional, get upset, get in bad moods, shout at people. They want people with high emotional intelligence, particularly in leadership positions, who can pick up the feelings of their staff and their teams and respond to them. But overall, like I said, the results of many studies suggest that things are a little bit more complicated than our original picture of individual differences. It's not just the case that people's personality creates organisational behaviours, but their personalities involve traits, attitudes, and behaviours. And in the research, particularly the psychometric research, where people have statistically modelled these things, they found that personality measures can influence work competence and can influence work performance, but there are social and cultural factors which affect it, the type of job people are doing, and the organisational context that people are in all play a big role as well in changing or moderating people's personality types and the ways those personalities interact with their behaviours. Okay, we're getting into this in some depth, I think. So let's see. Well, we've talked about individual differences. That's the understanding of people as having differences on some set criteria or traits. We've talked about the nature of personality, the idea that personality is a stable set of behaviours and attitudes that is thought to reveal some underlying trait. And we've talked about psychometric tests and how to interpret psychometric test results. We want to shift gear a little bit now to think about a different way of thinking about personality, and that is the notion of the self. When I was talking about how people fill in psychometric tests, I suggested that often people have a sense of who they want to be, and this influences what they score on psychometric tests. So it's not always the case that people tell you who they are, but they tell you who they want to be. Psychologists interested in understanding this concept of the self take this idea, this division between who people are and who people want to be, as the basis of their understanding of personality. And they say, instead of thinking of personality as a thing somebody has, we have to think of personality as an ongoing process, an ongoing construction in which people are constantly thinking about themselves, who they are, who they want to be, and who they think the world around them wants to be. So it's much more about, as in this image, people looking in the mirror and seeing what do they like what they see looking back at them. A famous theorist here is George Herbert Mead. He says that we have a self-concept, a sense of who we are, which he calls the I, which is our sense of who we are, our sense of the person that we recognise in ourselves, in our behaviour. You know, you'll sometimes find yourself, I'm sure, saying like, oh, that wasn't me. I don't talk like that, or I don't do those kinds of things. This is us expressing our I, our sense of who we are. Then there's the me, which is the norms and values about who we should be that we internalise from our society. So we have an I am this person. But then there's a me, I should be this. We also, Mead said, have a generalised other, which is our understanding of what other people expect from us. So that's almost like as if we've got somebody watching us the whole time and moderating what we do, because we think we might have an audience. And Mead said then we have our sense of who we are, our sense of who we think we should be, we have our sense of our social obligations in our me, but then we also have our self-esteem, which is our evaluation of who we are. So, you might know that you are a neurotic person, but you might not like that about yourself. So this is our self-esteem. So you can have, according to Mead, you have your sense of self, it's your personality type, but then you have your self-esteem, which is how much you actually like yourself. And Mead argues people with low self-esteem often engage in behaviours to try to raise their self-esteem. So they might try to change who they are, they might try to reject the norms and values of the me, or they might challenge the generalised others in order to raise their self-esteem. And it's argued that this explains a lot of people's behaviour in organisations that, for example, abusive supervisors might secretly have a low self-esteem, and they're trying to act in a way that gives themselves more power to raise their self-esteem over others. Another theorist of the self is Carl Rogers. And Rogers is particularly interested in thinking about the self as a process. Thinking about the self, he calls it the two-sided self. That whenever we're thinking about who we are, which we do because it gives us meaning and consistency. So you could think almost back to our class on motivation and Viktor Frankl's idea that people search for meaning. People need to have meaning in their lives in order to be motivated to do things. Roger says it's our sense of who we are that ultimately gives us meaning, but we don't have a fixed sense of who we are. Rather, it's a process between the way we see ourselves and the way we think others see us. It's the expectations we have from ourselves and what we think others expect of us. It's our personal feelings about ourselves, but then also how we think other people see us. And Roger said our sense of self is a constant mediation between these two sides. So when the self almost exists in this dash in between each of these things. And a little bit like Mead, Roger said he called the term maladjusted individuals. And maladjusted individuals who are unable to mediate these two things. So the way they see themselves for maladjusted individuals is too different from the way they think other people see them. And they're unable to find ways of coping with those differences. Adjusted individuals that aren't necessarily perfect, but they're happy with who they are and they think there's some consistency between these two sides of the self. So Roger said that everybody ultimately has a drive to be treated with what he calls unconditional positive regard. And that's not to say that we're perfect, but to feel like others accept our imperfections. And others expect our imperfections because nobody's perfect. So this, Roger said, is what drives us to act. So this, you can see, is a very different theorization of personalities. If the concept of the self or our personality is constructed in an ongoing process, well, it becomes very difficult to measure. However, many organizational researchers would argue that these kinds of concepts, notions of the self, self-identity, self-esteem, provide stronger explanations for people's behaviour in organisations than psychometrics. So, if we go back to our first slide, all of these approaches accept the idea that personality is an antecedent to organisation behaviours. However, how they theorise personality, that might be in terms of self-esteem, self-concept, psychometric measurements, it might be unconscious attitudes in the thematic apperception test, are very different. They're very different theorisations of personality. So, hopefully you feel like we've met these learning objectives. I think we have defined individual differences. We've talked about the nature of personality in terms of an idiographic and nomitheic perspective. We've spent a bit of time thinking about psychometric tests. And then finally, we've tried to confuse ourselves somewhat by thinking about the self. If you've got any questions, please leave them on the discussion forum or come to the Ask Me Anything drop-in Q&As.